Hi everyone. As promised, I start this edition of Jamdani Weeds by bringing you a very exciting conversation. For those of you who are interested in muslins and Jamdani, uh, my conversation today is with someone who needs absolutely no introduction. Hers is literally the first name that pops up when you start any semblance of a research on muslins. I'm delighted to have with me today Dr. Sonia Ashmore, who has done the most seminal, indeed the most pioneering work in muslins. She has been associated with the Victoria and Albert Museum in London for a long time. She's worked as a textile historian. She's been particularly interested in British Asian cultural exchanges, and that's been her forte. And she's going to tell us firsthand today about her investigative and rather adventurous journey into the history of muslin. So, very warm welcome to you, Dr. Ashmore.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I think you've rather exceeded my reputation, but very nice to be here.
Thank you so much. So why don't you jump right in and tell us a little bit about your journey into the history of muslins?
Victoria and Albert Museum made a very beautiful book. I'm sorry it's out of print. They let many books go out of print in the last few years, which is a shame, as the books were intended to explain the various exhibits in the museum, or trying to explain the collections. So they're quite specialized. And as I'd been working on their huge Indian textile collection, which is more than 10,000 objects, I began to notice that there was absolutely no information about this absolutely beautiful fabric, muslin, and also what I came to know as Jamdani. So after a while, I searched around and there was nothing. There was one book written for the Great Exhibition of 1851, which is very interesting, but it was a long time ago. So I suggested a book on muslin, and they said, oh, I don't know, we're just doing one on wedding dresses. We don't want another white book. And I said, but it's not all white. Anyway, they loved the idea after a bit and made this very beautiful book. But I do have to stress that it is based on the museum collections, and so a lot of things are omitted. I was working here in this huge, wonderful museum in South Kensington, which some people may have been to, and I was in the research department somewhere over here, and the South Asian textile collection at that time was in some rooms over here. You can see one of them on the right. It was very dull. You went into a room and there were lots of steel cabinets, which looked very unpromising. But the minute that you opened them, out came the colors and the patterns and the vibrancy and even the smell of the textiles from India. And it was completely overwhelming and addictive. So this was when I started my research. They said, you better go and have a look and get familiar with what's there. So this was a very exciting start to my journey, so that was the start of my journey, really, just going through all the objects, using the wonderful art library there, using the British Library, and then eventually traveling to different places in Britain, also going to West Bengal, though at the time I wasn't able to go to Bangladesh. I hope that I reflected the range of what was in the collection, and of course we were dealing with what we now call undivided Bengal, so it was acknowledged that that's where the textiles came from, and they're labelled, many of the muslins are labelled as coming from Dhaka in the catalogues.
So Dr. Ashmore, when we were talking about this earlier, you had mentioned, for example, that in the course of your investigations, you discovered the variety of different cloths even under the tag of muslin. You want to tell us a little bit about that?
Well, as you probably know, muslin is made from cotton, and from a very specific type. These very fine muslins were made from a very specific type of cotton called tree cotton, or Corsypium arboreum, and I am afraid it is wrong in the books. I believe what it said in Kew Gardens. Right? I admit my mistake. But anyway, it's made from these very particular type of cotton whose fibers, it grows only in the sort of delta, river delta areas around what is now Dhaka, Bangladesh. And it was a kind of cottage industry of growing, preparing the cotton. It was a family, like a family enterprise, a cottage industry in which the extended family and neighborhood would be involved in the production and processing of the cotton and the cotton yarn, and then at the final end, the weaving. So it's a very simple fabric. You just a simple over and under weave. There's nothing complicated. The fibers aren't twisted. They aren't 1/2 or 2/1. It's just one strand of yarn woven over another, which I hope you can just about see in this slide. Because of the quality of the cotton yarn and the not very long lengths of the fibers, when the cotton was spun by hand, you got little tiny joins in the fiber. And I think I did ask weavers about this, and they agreed with me that it makes little tiny rough parts in the fabric, tiny, soft but rough, where these little tiny joins are. And it gives, one of the things that gives muslin its particularly seductive, soft texture once the starch is all washed out. So the softness is something that made it very appealing to wear, apart from the lightness. And so I think these images are meant to show that kind of light, transparent quality of the actual basic material. This is the title page and the book of images of the book that was published in 1851 by a man who was managing what they call one of the cotton factories in Bengal for the East India Company. So it was a very in-depth knowledge of, whatever we think about the East India Company, he had a lot of experience. So he was making first-hand observations of what he was seeing there. And he describes the process in some detail and gives these illustrations, which were then reproduced in other books. And I think the interesting thing about this is all preparing the yarn, preparing the warp, preparing the reed, weaving, and then all these other tasks that are also shown and described. Really, I think they're actually not very different today. The fascinating thing is that whereas the techniques that you see seem almost, they could be from any time in past history. Today, still people are making fine fabrics using exactly the same methods. So that is extraordinary to see when you see it for yourself. So here are some examples, photographs taken in Bangladesh fairly recently, which compare with these little drawings from the 1851 book. And here is a probably early 20th century photograph of men in a Bengal village preparing the warp threads. Even the plain muslin varied enormously, and these two examples I put side by side because they kind of emphasize what the muslin from Dhaka area so special. You see, it has a particular light open weave that isn't the same in the Deccani South Indian weave. And you see that this isn't an isolated example, you see many examples of this. And so this is because they use this particular type of cotton and adapted their spinning and weaving skills to match this particular variety of cotton. And I'm not sure what variety of cotton was used in South India, but clearly the results aren't quite the same. And there's another example here. So the British were very, very keen on measuring everything. They like to know the exact sort of dimensions of their empire, if you like. So this is from a book which is showing many examples of Indian handmade cloth that were available at the time. So they show again two examples. One is of what they call Dhaka muslin, which 11 meters weighed 112 grams. And then the Chandari muslin from further south, Madhya Pradesh, where the same length of muslin would weigh 142 grams. And you could get even finer examples than the one on the left. So this was just to show the difference here. It's difficult to know how much Jamdani came to Britain. I mean, it was obviously highly valued in India and worn by the elite. And as with all of the finest muslin, they were worked in, it was made in special workshop or karkhana, made, I don't know if that's the right pronunciation, but they were made for the courts. And so the best stuff went to the ruling elites and would have been expensive then as it is now. And it's difficult to know how much Jamdani muslin came into England because they didn't really call it that. So sometimes you see Jamdani spelt with 2 E's at the end, and sometimes they talk about flowered muslin, so you don't know whether they're talking about chicken or Jamdani or what. And in the examples, surviving examples of dress seem to be more, that have been, of where the fabric was made in India, seem to be more embroidered than Jamdani, but I don't know why that is. It's something yet, a mystery to be uncovered for somebody, I think. Yeah, so here's an example of chicken work. Obviously, very many different styles of chicken, but here is one. So it was, the embroidery is thought to have started in Dhaka and then moved, it became the fabric of Lucknow, became almost the kind of national fabric of Lucknow and became a great industry there. In the center you have the Jamdani from again, they're all from Dhaka. And on the right, so this may have been flowered muslin, this may have been flowered muslin, we don't know. On the right, you've got a hand embroidered length of muslin embroidered with red spots, every spot embroidered by hand. And this was a style very much enjoyed in England. And you often, think of Jane Austen, My Spotted Muslins, they have this feeling this is what young ladies like to wear very much, it's sort of thought of as pretty. And also, I suppose it had the advantage that you could make any design of dress with a length of Indian fabric from something which had a regular repeat like this, whereas with Jamdani it would be more difficult. So I guess with the Jamdani they would have had to weave lengths that would suit the style of dress. So maybe again that's why embroidered fabrics were may have been more popular. It's just a thought. I'm not really sure if that's so. So very many different styles. Some of them, particularly in South India, you get, I haven't shown an example, but embellished with gold wire and tinsel and beetle wings and, all sorts of sparkles, because that was favored there. Whereas in the north, the sort of plainer ones seem to have been, or the less elaborate ones, the work, what they appreciated was the work in the weaving and the embroidery, whereas in the south you wanted bit of added bling, perhaps.
In fact, I was reading about imperial ball gowns being embellished with beetle wings, for example.
Yes, that became very popular in Europe, actually. Huge numbers of, well, first of all, the fabrics were exported from India, and then they also exported beetle wings to Britain. And people would sew them, either it became a kind of hobby, or else seamstresses would sew them onto dresses. So you can see some very elaborate, there were a huge number of varieties were shipped and you paid accordingly. And there were even guides published very early on for the British customer to know what kind of muslin was worth buying and which would fall to pieces and which would wash well and which wouldn't wash well and so on. So there was a huge variety.
Sure.
That's true. The other thing to mention muslin was that, of course, it had been preceded in popularity by what we call chintz, or we call kalamkari in India. So the previous fashion, great fashion imported from India that revolutionized the way that people dressed in England really, was the importing of hand-dyed and painted cotton chintz from the Coromandel coast. It was so popular that it was outlawed in Britain, and there were many laws to ban it because they were worried about undermining the British textile industry. So that's another story really, but muslin began to come in to England as little scarves or fichus or frills around your wrists, or for men, perhaps a cravat or an apron, which became a kind of expensive decorative accessory. It turned into fashions for women. Whereas in India, muslin had obviously been used as clothing for men and women partly because it's ideally suited to the climate. So you can make as many layers as you want. And there's a wonderful jama in the Victoria and Albert Museum, a man's jama that has 177 panels in the skirt alone of muslin.
Wow.
So that's an extraordinary, so it gives it this wonderful fullness because it's so light. And this is a portrait of one of Tipu Sultan's, in the center, one of Tipu Sultan's ambassadors to France, who are trying to get support for Tipu Sultan from the French court. But this man, Muhammad Dervish Khan, was painted by a fashionable woman portrait painter and she absolutely loved muslin. She dressed in muslin, she dressed her children in muslin, and she notoriously painted the Queen Marie Antoinette in muslin, for which she was highly criticized because they said a queen shouldn't be represented in her underwear. So, but she was very impressed by this Indian gentleman in his muslin garments. But in England, when it comes to England, it becomes a fashion for women, really. And apart from the few accessories for men, it really becomes an example of extremely feminine dress, and very much suited to this new simple style of dress known as Empire style, partly after what was happening in France. Became the style of the revolution, if you like, away from fancy court dress into simple, classical, kind of Greek-inspired dress. And that was worn by Empress Josephine and her, her fashionable circle. And it was also much lighter, probably, and more comfortable to wear. You didn't have to have a great infrastructure underneath of corsets and hoops and everything. They were mostly white, but not all white at all. They had them dyed different colors. So I think in the West, white was mainly worn for the evening, for dances and balls and so on. Whereas in the daytime, you'd wear a colored one. And Jane Austen talks about this in her letters to her sister. Talks about going to buy various cloths and pieces of muslin, and she talks about the colors. She talks about brown quite a lot, funnily enough, and but I think either sort of embroidered or colored were the more suitable for day wear, especially in the English climate.
Right.
It was a muslin dress worn by Empress Josephine, wife of the Emperor Napoleon of France. She had hundreds of muslin dresses, and again, this use of this spot muslin is very interesting in this child's dress of about 1800, and it's using this spotted muslin, and I would imagine it was made from a leftover piece of an adult's dress, perhaps, that was made, because it's just a tiny little piece and it's got inserts of European lace and things in it. But I would imagine, you'd make that with what was left over from mother's dress or something. So this was the kind of fabric that was made of. That was just white.
And of course, we know the rather dubious stories of fingers and thumbs of weavers being cut off. That's the kind of lore that has pervaded through Bangladesh and into India to explain why the muslin weavers lost their livelihoods at that time. I know that you don't subscribe to that. You haven't found any historic account of it, and instead you have, you've researched into how the muslin industry sprung up in Europe itself. So would you tell us a little bit about that?
In a nutshell, the East India Company but they were hugely admiring of Indian fabrics and muslin and jamdani. They saw it as a kind of cash cow. I mean, it was making a lot of money because, first of all, it was very cheap to send to England compared to other fabrics because it was so light. You could have 10,000 pieces of fabric in one shipping. I counted on one list. So that was one thing, and they were very good at marketing their fabrics. So it didn't happen by itself. It was partly promotion, partly fashion leaders wearing it, and so on. As with chintz, as it happened with chintz. but they began to push their weavers too much. They treated them rather like cogs in a factory machine. They wanted them to produce more and more and more, faster and faster. And then, of course, they complained that the quality went down. And the weavers became indebted to them. Their machinery was mortgaged. There were famines, there were earthquakes, there were various catastrophes, and all these things combined, combined with the sort of malpractices of the East India Company, really contributed to the decline of the trade. Plus, they started making it in England, partly encouraged by these people that I've mentioned before in the 19th century, but even earlier. Here are some examples from the late 18th century from Scotland, where they had very, very skilled weavers who had been making things like silk gauze that they exported to France. And they kind of picked up on they're not so much these ones, but they picked up on the idea, the theme of chikan and jamdani, and incorporated that into their weaving very successfully. They produced some very beautiful fabrics, actually. And that developed into a whole cottage industry, and then a machine industry, making muslin. And then there would be girls working at their home on farms doing all the embroidery. And they spun some of it out to Ireland. So it became a sort of big business, but eventually became completely industrialized. And there were other parts of England, for example, Bolton, in northwest England, where they were also made muslin, and people became very rich, and apparently went around where the £10 notes in their hat bands. They were showing how wealthy they were from making this fabric. But as you might just see from these examples in a pattern book from the 1820s, it was a much cruder, far cruder than anything from India, and even cruder than anything from Scotland. So there were lots of attempts to make it, and then they would print it with English floral designs that were completely untypical of Bengali muslin. So here we've got a hand loom weaver in Scotland that I put in because really it's not so very different from the hand loom weaver in Bengal, except that he's inside, he isn't in a little hut. So this is taken as late as 1906 on a slightly more elaborate loom, but you kind of get the feeling. And here's his friend sitting smoking his pipe and so on. And on the right hand side, you can see how the whole process became industrialized.
So this is the future. This is what
Yes.
it currently looks like. So tell us a little bit about your explorations back in India and in Bangladesh.
Well, whilst I was writing the book, I was in India, and I went to visit. Interestingly enough, I was taken to visit a weaver who was descended from a family that would have been in Bangladesh. And like many other people, they'd had to partition, they'd had to come to India. So there are a lot of hand weavers in West Bengal now. And it's not this person, but he was learning how to do jamdani, and has since been very successful. And here we've got a weaver in a village near Dhaka in Bangladesh, where I went in 2016 and 2019. So 2016, I was invited to go to Mr. Saiful Islam's festival of Jamdani and exhibition, and we went to visit weavers there, which was fascinating. And you can see the hand introductionary of the secondary motif in the weave here, and in the small illustration, I hope. So these fabrics are woven from the back, and often you have two weavers, so they're weaving in different directions. So they have to be all their actions have to be perfectly matched. So it's really extraordinary, the skill and the precision and the mathematical calculations that these weavers have to hold in their heads. And this isn't something you can learn in an instant. It almost has to get into you from childhood. So this is one of the problems of for the future is that it's becoming less and less attractive as an occupation now in modern Asia. It's a fragile occupation, and you have to persuade the next generation that it's something worth doing, and they'll only do that if there are markets and they're paid adequately for what they do. Because when the second time I went to Bangladesh, it was 2019 for a Jamdani festival put on by the Bengal Foundation, in which they and other people had sponsored weavers to produce very, very high quality Jamdani, following historical models. And the results were absolutely astonishing. Some of these lengths of Jamdani took, one of them took 2 weavers 10 months to weave. So they probably work 6 days a week, 10 hours a day. So how do you recompense somebody in normal life for doing something like that? And they're not highly paid. So hopefully, with more practice and more encouragement, this will become easier for them so they can continue to produce the high quality Jamdani. But they need support as communities. They need sort of official recognition of their value, really. And that is sort of disappearing so much with handloom all across South Asia. I was, really impressed and moved by my visits there, and the kind of extreme skill that's practiced in such very modest circumstances, really. I think that also, as well, from what I can see, that young designers have got really excited by Jamdani. I mean, fashion designers and so on, and they're finding new ways of using it, not just for Saree, which is of course important, but very important. But if you're going to keep these crafts alive, you've got to find many outlets for them. So basically, it's the hands we've got to protect. These hands that are doing all these processes. And this is actually a detail from an older man and a younger man threading the reeds through which all the threads pass, keep them separated in the loom. So it's this need to keep these lovely hands from going to working on building sites or textile factories. The last one, yes, I'd like to mention that I'm part of a very small charity in London that is trying to, in small ways, raise a sort of interest in Jamdani, and we've had 2 publicly funded projects. One was called Jamdani Project, where we commissioned some Jamdani from weavers in Bangladesh, and then we got these young people to come, and they were taught to design an outfit, which would be similar to the kind of thing that would have been worn in the early 1800s using Indian muslin. And they were taught how to sew. None of them had ever done any sewing, and there were boys and girls, and they designed and made completely by hand, no sewing machines, a few garments, and there are 2 of the girls wearing them. So that was very exciting. And they were also shown at the festival in Dhaka in 2016. And now we're doing another publicly funded project, which is to capture the memories of Bangladeshi women who came to England in the 1970s, and about their clothing memories and their feelings about Jamdani and what they meant to them when they came here. So we've been interviewing a number of women, and we'll photograph and film them and do a little book and an exhibition. It's all been a bit difficult with lockdown, with COVID and so on, but we're getting there. So, and, we want to continue doing other projects that will, somehow raise the profile of Jamdani in this country, however small a way.
Oh, wonderful. That sounds really interesting. You're right, because I think for all of us who, claim origins from Bangladesh, and for us, Jamdanis are not so much, I can speak for myself when I say that it's not just about handloom, but it's so wrapped up in culture, it's so wrapped up in my heritage, in the stories of my childhood, what my grandmother wore, and all of that. So it's very deeply wrapped up in my personal story, in my personal history. And I think if somewhere we're able to make those connections, then it's a very important exercise in trying to keep a tradition alive, because you see it as something that links up to your childhood, and therefore you want to make that extra effort in order to preserve it or to play your part in that preservation. So I think connecting it to personal narratives is a very important part of keeping the tradition alive. Thank you so much. I mean, this has been an incredibly, sort of eye-opening exercise. So one of my favorite, historical romance novelists is Georgette Hare, who used to write extensively about muslin. I remember as a young girl in school, I would read like her book Sprig Muslin, for example. So there was a certain romance associated, the whole Victorian romance around muslin. And somehow that and the stories of my grandmother and the Sarees and the Jamdanis, the twain didn't really meet in my head, I guess. I didn't make the connections. And I think conversations with you and how you've interconnected the two makes it very interesting, because you also, with it comes the story of trade, of partition, of the colonial rule, and the whole history of India really is wrapped up in this diaphanous fabric. So
I had no idea when I embarked on the book what I was letting myself in for. I didn't, because I was covering the museum collections, there were obviously a lot of Western clothes. I didn't realize it was going to be such a global story. I thought I was going to look at India muslin, that was it. And I didn't realize I was going to look at sort of Western history, even America, and how fashion spreads and who were the super spreaders of fashion, if you like, and how long fashion lasted for, and all the political intrigues and sort of economic aspect of it. So, it became a far bigger story than I ever imagined, and I had to cram it all into quite a thin book.
And thank you so much for cramming that story into this half hour for us. I think everyone's going to really enjoy listening to you. I'm deeply grateful for you agreeing to do this with me and sharing some of the journey. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.
Bye. Goodbye.